Good morning, people of grace. It's great to see all of you. Merry Christmas, 3 days early. We're so glad that you're sharing this time with us. We have been celebrating Advent these past 4 Sundays, and if you've been here, most of you have, we've talked about how the early church presented the gospel through the simple pictures of these candles. Many times the churches were filled with illiterate people who couldn't read their own Bibles. Many times they didn't have a Bible in their own language. So this became a tradition early on in the church to share the main points of the gospel through these Advent candles. Advent means the arrival and the waiting for that arrival. The first Advent was at Christmas, and we're awaiting the second Advent when Jesus comes again for us. But these 4 candles, as we've talked about, represent, first of all, the hope of Christmas, which we talked about the first Sunday. And then we talked about the faith in Christmas, in the Christ child. We've talked about the peace of Christmas last week. And this week, we end this by talking about the love at Christmas. This is obviously what Christmas is all about. The best verse that represents the love of Christmas is the familiar John 3:16. For God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, so that whoever believes in him should not perish, but will have everlasting life. A few months ago, we went through the book of 1 John, one of John's letters after he wrote the Gospel of John, and he said, "In this is love, not that we have loved God, but that he loved us and sent his Son to be the propitiation for our sins." That word propitiation, as we talked about many times, is the word of the one who satisfies the wrath of God toward our sins. He is the covering, like the lamb's blood in the Old Testament. He is the propitiation for our sins. And then John talks about not just vertical love from God to us, but our love to one another. Beloved, if God so loved us, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God abides in us, and his love is perfected or matured in us. And his point there, if you remember back to those weeks when we were in 1 John, is that we can't see God, but we can see God in those who represent him when we share love with one another. It's something the world doesn't understand. We live in a world of you treat me well, I'll treat you well. Tit for tat. But the gospel calls us to love like God loved us and sent his Son. We love unconditionally in that way. I want to read a story this morning from Max Lucado, who's a great storyteller. And as I thought about the candle of love this morning, I thought about this story. He says, a friend of mine was at Disney World some time back. He and his family sought a place to rest in Cinderella's castle. Unfortunately, so did everyone else. The place was packed with kids and parents. Suddenly, all the children rushed to one side of the room. Had it been a boat, the castle would have tipped over. Cinderella had entered the room. Cinderella, the pristine princess, a gorgeous young girl with each hair in place, flawless skin, and a beaming smile. She stood waist deep waist deep in a garden of kids, each wanting to touch and be touched. The other side of the castle was now vacant except for a boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old. His age was hard to determine because of the disfigurement of his body. Dwarfed in height, face deformed, he stood watching quietly and wistfully, holding the hand of his older brother. Don't you know what he wanted? Dwarfed. He wanted to be with the children. Face deformed. He longed to be in the middle of the kids, reaching for Cinderella, holding the hand of his older brother. But can't you feel his fear? Don't you know what he wanted? Fear of death. He wanted to be with the children. Face deformed. Fear of being taunted in the middle of the kids, reaching for Cinderella. Don't you wish Cinderella would go to him? But can't you feel his fear? Don't you know what he wanted? She did. Fear of death. He wanted to be noticed, the little boy. Fear of being immediately in the middle of the kids, reaching for Cinderella. Don't you wish Cinderella would go through the crowd of children? Can't you feel his fear? Don't you know what he wanted? She did. Fear of death. Quickly wanted to be noticed, the little boy. Never being immediately in the middle of the kids, reaching for Cinderella. Don't you wish Cinderella inching through the crowd of children? This story, don't you know what he wanted? Reminds me of another word. Quickly wanted to be noticed, the little boy. The names are being immediately in the middle of the kids, reaching for Cinderella. Don't you wish Cinderella inching through the crowd of children? This story, don't you know what he wanted? Reminds me of another word. Quickly wanted to be boy in the castle. The names are being immediately in the middle of the kids, in both cases, don't you wish in both cases, the crowd of children. This story, in both cases, the lovely one quickly wanted to be boy in the castle. The names are being immediately in the middle of the kids, in both cases, don't you wish Cinderella gave only both cases, the crowd of children. She stood to me in both cases, the reminds me of quickly wanted to be boy in the castle. The names are being immediately in the middle of Cinderella had done both cases, don't you wish Cinderella gave only both cases, the crowd of children. She stood to me in both cases, the reminds me of quickly wanted to be boy in the castle. The names are being immediately in the middle of Cinderella had done both cases, took our suffering. Cinderella gave only both cases, the crowd of children. She stood to me in both cases, reminds me of quickly wanted to be boy in the castle. The names are being immediately in the middle of Cinderella had done well, took our suffering. Cinderella gave only both cases, the crowd of children. She stood to me in both cases, reminds me of quickly wanted to be boy in the castle. The names are being immediately in the middle of Cinderella had done well, took our suffering. Cinderella gave only both cases, the crowd of children. She stood to me in both cases, reminds me of quickly wanted to be boy in the castle. The names are being immediately in the middle of Cinderella had done well, took our suffering. Cinderella gave only both cases, the crowd of children. She stood to me in both cases, reminds me of quickly wanted to be boy in the castle. The names are being immediately in the middle of Cinderella had done well, took our suffering. Cinderella gave only both cases, the crowd of children. She stood to me in both cases, reminds me of quickly wanted to be boy in the castle. The names are being immediately in the middle of Cinderella had done well, took our suffering. Cinderella gave only both cases, the crowd of children. She stood to me in both cases, reminds me of quickly wanted to be boy in the castle. The names are being immediately in the middle of Cinderella had done well, took our suffering. Cinderella gave only both cases, the crowd of children. She stood to me in both cases, reminds me